She said, "What's the problem? They're Arabs, aren't they?" The site, the first site of our building, our home, destroyed, was, I think, must be similar to Gazans coming up from the shelter and suddenly their home is gone above them. But he said in leaving Belzon, it was at the height of winter, he saw piles of frozen bodies stacked like logs, and it was a rule of terror. They hunted Jews.
I've always felt that the biggest injustice is that 2 million people's lives and hopes and dreams have just been utterly destroyed.
Absolutely.
And taken away.
To take in at a glance that your life effort is gone in an instant. What kind of experience is that? She, as well as the heroic aunt, both ended up living in Haifa. When I visited them in the 60s for the first time, I realized that they became racists.
If you could speak back to the boy who survived the Holocaust, what words would you have for him? Okay, we good? Should I clap? You clap? Who's gonna clap?
Yes, please. Could you clap, Ashfaaq?
Okay. Hi, good day, and welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. I'm your host, Ashfaaq Carim, and I'm very glad today to be with Stephen Kapos. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, and hello.
Stephen is, I don't usually introduce guests by mentioning their age, so apologies for this, but I think it's relevant. Stephen is 87 years old, and he's a Holocaust survivor, and he's been a very, very, almost a fixture at the pro-Palestine protests. He's also been questioned for police, which is a bit ridiculous, and we'll talk about all of that. We're going to talk about your journey from, being in the middle of World War II as a child until now. So just to start things off, we're going to start things off with your story about World War II and your mom and your family. But before we get there, and this is usually a question I'll ask near the end of the interview, but I think it's kind of interesting to ask it now. What do you hope that people who listen to this conversation that we're about to have, what do you hope they take from the conversation?
I think probably one of the most important messages is that the attitude of Jewish people has generally been misrepresented as supporters of the actions of the government of Israel, and this is really incorrect. There is a very large part of the number of Jews around the world who oppose the Israeli action and the Zionists generally, but they don't have a voice, and particularly in a UK context, all official representation they refer to the Jewish community, which is a non-existent concept, because within the Jewish community there are all kinds of opinions. There are the Orthodox Jews, and there are the entirely secular people, and I belong to the secular group, if you like. And politically, they are very diverse. There is a group within the Labour Party quite influential, the Jewish Labour Movement, which are self-proclaimed Zionists. But there is an opposing group of radical left-wing Jewish people who are organized under JVL, Jewish Voice for Labour. They are ignored because they don't support, they're not convenient for the official government line.
Okay, I'm looking forward to unpacking why they are ignored and everything else. But before we get to all of that, let's go back. Let's go back to your life. I believe you grew up in Hungary.
Yes.
What are your earliest memories, even preceding what became the Holocaust, if you have any?
Okay. My father was a doctor, and my very earliest memories are in the villages, a couple of villages where he was GP, and the environment of the countryside and the particular building where we lived in. My uncle was not fully qualified, but a sort of architect, and he designed a modern building within this traditional village where we lived. And there are memories about that, and how the villages looked, and the people were quite simple, if you like, and still wearing traditional dress, and lots of them without shoes still, and so on. And then we moved to Budapest, because my father trained as a psychoanalyst. While he was practicing as a GP, he was traveling back to Budapest, because these villages were very close to Budapest, but it was then still very much the countryside. Today, they had become absorbed in Budapest as outlying districts, with a tram line extended to reach them. So it's completely different now. But anyway, my father was doing his training and then qualified as a psychoanalyst. And when we moved to Budapest, into a modern flat in the middle of town, our location was really quite extraordinary, very close to the Danube, Parliament, ministries, and a great boulevard, which was close to one of the major bridges, with tram lines running and so on. It was a bit like living on top of Oxford Street in this country, and I loved that. Actually, I was very happy with the town life, although we had no greenery except parks, which were. There was one park in front of Parliament where we used to go, or an island in the Danube, which was close to us, Margaret Island, which was the entire island was a park, and that's where we went to, or taken as small kids to play.
And it was just yourself, your mom, your dad. Did you have any siblings when you moved to
Yes,
Budapest?
that's right. When I was 7, I had a sister who was 2 years old, and she was looked after by my mom during the Holocaust period, and I was elsewhere, because boys and girls were separated when we were in these protected, inverted commas, homes on false papers and so on.
What can you remember? What can you remember about your first encounter with, like, your personal experience with the Holocaust, or what became the Holocaust, or what was unfolding? Like you mentioned, you were separated from your sister. Like, what's your first memory of, was it officers who came to your home? Were you like, what happened?
Yeah, so funny you should say that, because there was such an occasion. I think my first sort of knowledge really of something is happening was March 1944. The German army invaded Hungary, because the Hungarian right-wing nationalist ruler, Admiral Horthy, who was a regent, he couldn't be crowned because he wasn't Roman Catholic, he was Protestant, and so he was just a regent, but very much an autocrat, and an ally of Hitler at the beginning of the war. Hungary joined the invasion of the Soviet Union with its army, such as it was, not very good. And but by 1944, it was absolutely clear that Germany was losing the war. And even somebody as close to the Germans and the Nazis as Admiral Horthy started to put out feelers towards the Western powers to try and negotiate a separate peace and leaving the German alliance, like Romania did just before, successfully. But the German intelligence got wind of these approaches, and so Hungary suddenly became an unreliable ally, and that's when the Germans invaded. So my first memory is seeing the German soldiers in the streets of Budapest, but nominally they were still as allies, although they invaded. So they weren't threatening, and as a child around that time, I was obsessed with war, and all my toys were kind of model guns and tanks and that sort of thing. And I saluted the German officers or any uniformed person on the street because I was so into army. And I remember one comment of a German officer, because at that time I was still blonde, had blonde hair, and a German officer said, in response to my saluting him, he said, "What a pity that this boy is not German." Little did he know that I was a Jew. But on one occasion, you mentioned about German officers, on one occasion, a branch of the family who at that time was living in Romania, in Bucharest, had made contact with some German army officer who was anti the regime. There were such people. And they sent him with some certain messages when he came to Budapest. And I remember the absolute fright of my parents when a uniformed German officer appeared at our door. But it turned out just with a friendly message, and I don't know, maybe she brought something as well as a present or something.
So was your sorry to interrupt you, but was your family sort of hiding their Jewish identity at the time, or what was the situation?
This was before. Well, in Hungary there were a series of discriminatory racist laws. It goes back to the 1920s, when Hungary, the first in Europe, brought in an anti-Jewish racist legislation. It was called the numerus clausus, which meant that only a certain number of people, Jewish people, could enter a particular profession or university per year. And as a result of that, my father, who was already studying medicine, had to do 1 year in Prague, because he was caught by this numerus clausus, which he enjoyed very much, actually. He loved the Czechs and Prague. There was a German language uni in Prague, and that's where he did 1 year of his medical studies. But then he could return at other time and finally qualified in a southern provincial university of Hungary. So that was the first racist legislation in Europe before Mussolini, and the Hungarian fascists were very proud of that. And during that pre-war period, or between-war period, between the First and Second World War, there was latent anti-Semitism in Hungary, almost everywhere. But it wasn't aggressive in its form. You could have a successful professional life as a Jew, but socially there was always a latent kind of rejection, if you like, implied. There's little social contact and or intermarriage or that kind of thing. But this was tolerable because you could have a successful career, and there were lots of Jewish doctors, lawyers, accountants, journalists, etc. But once the Germans came in, they came in with Eichmann. And then there was a rapid series of more aggressively discriminatory laws passed, ever more severe. and one of these laws was to kind of mark all Jews by wearing the yellow star. And I do remember my family, the family atmosphere of my mother and aunt sewing on. You had to find some yellow material and make your own star and sew it on by law. You had to have it on your garments when you were outside.
Did you also, as a child?
Yes, I had to as
Okay.
well. Notwithstanding that I was 7-year-old. Yes. Now I jump back to a connection of this because not long ago I watched on TV a report of a session of the Security Council of the United Nations, and when it came to the Israeli ambassador to UN saying his piece, to introduce it very theatrically, he put on a yellow star, and I thought that was absolutely sickening, because you know, we had such dreadful memories attached to that dehumanization and humiliation of having to be different and marked in that way, which was always with negative implications. And that he was doing it as a kind of link to all this experience in connection with the issues of Palestine and Gaza. And it was cheapening the experience. It was hijacking the memory and the pain of it. And I thought it was absolutely awful.
How do you, just coming back to the story, so how did you, like you mentioned, you and your sister were separated. So what happened? Like, were you taken away? What happened with you, your family?
Well,
it was just you and your sister and your mom and dad.
Okay. Well, this connects to, well, because of the series of laws being passed against Jews, there was a relative, for a period, a relative easing of the laws relevant to converted Jews, those Jews who converted to Christianity, and a large number of Jewish families chose that facility or opportunity in order to evade some of the laws, and so did my family. And I remember the occasion when this happened, and it was then entered on your birth certificate that you had converted. And then for a period only, a short period, certain laws didn't apply, but later on they ignored any differentiation.
So even if you converted once,
then you know it was a short fix.
Yes.
Now I have to talk about a rather complicated story here about the project of the Rudolf Kastner project. Have you heard of Kastner? No. Well, Kastner was a prominent Transylvanian Jewish Zionist leader. My family, on my mother's side, come from Transylvania. They were farming, a small estate really, in Transylvania. Kastner came up from Transylvania into Budapest, and somehow convinced the Budapest Jewish leadership that he could negotiate on behalf of their organization as Jews. And he negotiated with Eichmann, a special deal whereby mainly Transylvanian Jews of the middle and upper classes, it was quite selective, would be saved with a special transport aiming at Switzerland, but going via Bergen-Belsen. I don't know why via Bergen-Belsen, but that's how it was. against delivering of certain goods and goods that the German army wanted, like trucks for the Eastern Front. It was stated that it would not be used against the Western Allies, but the Eastern Front, and materials, things like textiles that they needed for uniforms, and money and jewelry. And so that was a deal with the devil, in a way. And against that, they would save 1,600 Jews in 2 transports. Well, there's an argument about whether there were 2 transports or 3, because the first big transport was divided, and a part went straight to Switzerland from Belgium, and the other part was delayed. So whether there was 1 or 2 transports, but there was then a third, and my family was involved with the third transport. In that, Kastner, whose deal actually via Eichmann went right up to Himmler, did set up a kind of holding camp in Budapest called the Columbus Street Camp, which was holding people, a transport in preparation for being shipped to Belgium. And my family, including myself and all my uncles and everybody, male, female, were in that camp for a period, awaiting this transportation.
So you were, how did you, so you voluntarily sort of got to the camp?
Exactly, it was voluntary entry into this
camp, into this waiting
inverted
camp,
comma,
yes.
privileged camp,
Okay.
which had SS guards outside to keep people out, not in,
Okay.
and Hungarian police inside. And it was like a camp with barracks and multiple bunks and straw-filled mattresses and horrible latrine. You know, it had many aspects of a camp, an ordinary camp, but you could leave it. I mean,
Okay, so you couldn't enter, but
yeah.
unless you had
So
permission,
after a
but you could leave.
while, you see, everything was based. Information was based on rumors. That I think that was one of the horrible aspects of the Holocaust, which is not so visible. That making life and death decisions were based on virtual rumors or information from the enemy and stuff like that. And that rhymes with Gaza as well.
Yes.
And so that it must have been because of some negative rumors that my family decided to leave the camp. And we went back to our original home, which was in a building which by that time was marked by a large yellow star.
Okay, so like a mainly Jewish
Yeah.
building.
Only Jews.
Okay.
Only Jews. The town was reorganized into an archipelago of virtual ghettos. You know,
Oh,
these
yeah.
were
This is where the Jews are.
yeah,
This is where-
that's right. Clearly, this was in preparation for transportation, so that it would be easy to collect
So
them up.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So we were in that state. And I ought to also mention that another event that happened is that my father and my uncles were all called up to report to the army to be organized into Jewish ancillary forced work battalions for the Eastern Front. And then they were in a holding camp for that. That was a terrible fate, to be in one of those battalions actually on the Eastern Front, because they were used for mine clearance. They were unarmed. They had to have a yellow armband to mark them, yes, and were abused by some brutal officers, and it was notoriously hard to be in one of those, and the survival rate was about 10% in all. Now, so that then came an amazing event that my mum and aunt together on one day, with kind of false Red Cross uniform with a headband and so on, went to this camp, bribed the guard, went in, called out their names, and brought them out.
Brought who out?
My father and my two uncles.
Okay. And they were in which camp?
This was the holding camp
for the Eastern Front.
For the Eastern Front, yes. I think it's an astonishingly brave thing to do,
Yes.
because you either could successfully bribe the guard, the armed guard, or you would be arrested yourself immediately.
Absolutely.
And yet they did it. I mean, I think that the women of the family were fantastic during this period, really heroic. And I will come back to the aunt in question, because there's something interesting about what happened to her later. So they were brought out, and they returned, the male members, returned to the Kastner camp.
Okay. So the privileged camp.
Because of the two alternatives,
The privileged one was better.
to try and trust the Nazi, because I often wonder, how could they make a decision to trust a Nazi deal? I mean, it could just as easily be that they would say, yes, thank you for all this that you delivered,
Yeah.
and now line up against the wall. But the choice was so awful that they did this. Now, what happened is, with my father, is that they were transported to Bergen-Belsen,
Okay.
as per the plan. But then Hitler got to know about this project, which was done previously behind his back. And Himmler very nearly was arrested. He was absolutely furious and stopped it. But again, it's another strange thing. The Germans, once they signed a contract, they had some regards for it. So they were treated as hostages within Belsen camp. They were delineated by barbed wire as a separate camp within a camp. And they had certain privileges. The degree of self-management. My father worked as a doctor for the camp. They could keep their own clothes, and they weren't tattooed with numbers or anything like that. And occasionally they could get even Red Cross parcels. My father said for all those privileges they were starving, all the same. But he said that what they could see about the ordinary camp, looking across the barbed wire, was like hell itself. People were totally dehumanized into a virtual animal state, fighting over soups that my father said, they themselves couldn't touch to try and eat. But in the other camp they were fighting over it. And they saw Kapos beating people to death for the slightest thing. And this went on all around them. Eventually, this privileged camp was transferred to Theresienstadt. And I always regret that I haven't questioned my father more about his experiences in the Holocaust. I only know what he voluntarily mentioned. But he said in leaving Belsen, it was at the height of winter, he saw piles of frozen bodies stacked like logs outside the camp. Anyway, he arrived in Theresienstadt, which was, as camps go, one of the lighter regimes, but it was regarded as a waiting room to Auschwitz. After a while, they would transfer people from there to Auschwitz. But in the meantime, it was a kind of relatively liberal sort of regime, and this is where the Red Cross visitors were taken as a kind of show camp. They had cultural things, they had theatre going, they had orchestra. There's a dreadful story of a children's orchestra and chorus, which had performances which they taped and so on, and then next day sent them to Auschwitz, all the kids. My father was mortally ill at one stage, but survived. He obviously had a strong constitution. So that was his story. Now coming back to mine. After we returned from the Kastner camp temporarily into our own flats, I was taken up into so-called protected homes on false papers and false identity, false name, everything, into a building, a villa in the Buddha Hills. This was the first of a home for children, Jewish children, supported by the Hungarian Protestant churches, the Reformed Church and which was Calvinist, and the Lutheran Evangelical Church, it was called. And one of the priests of the Evangelical Church was tasked by his bishop to organize rescue of those Jewish children who were converted into Christianity. It was kind of selective to begin with, but this was a wonderful man who was in charge. This priest, Pastor Stelo, his name. Now there are monuments for him in Budapest set up. And starting with one building, which was donated by a very rich family, the Hagemacher brewing family, who were equivalent of the Guinness in this country. A luxury villa. Hagemacher had connections to Switzerland. His family was part Swiss, and they were, at the beginning of the war, left for Switzerland. And he donated his villa for this purpose. So I was taken up there, and this is a palatial place.
And it was just your family wasn't with you, your mom?
No,
sister, just you?
My aunt, one of my aunts, was there, actually.
Okay. And she was there in what, like,
Yeah.
also like sort of helping look after kids, or?
That's right, yes,
Okay.
in a kind of nurse role.
Okay.
Now, this whole organization was also sponsored by the Swiss Red Cross, because of partly of this connection of the Hagemacher family. Stelo, the man in charge, was a cousin of this Hagemacher rich family. And he started to organize a whole, again, it's like an archipelago of places of rescue for Jewish children. In the end, the organization saved about 2,000 children. But I was in the first lot. And then from arrival at this rather palatial place, we were distributed into smaller buildings. But all, as far as I was concerned, a number of them in the same area, in the Buddha Hills, which is overlooking the Danube, and it was a kind of, well, an expensive, privileged part of Budapest, close to the royal castle. And my mother was in charge of a girls' group, not too far from there.
And so she was with your sister?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
That's right. I was with my aunt. My mother.
Your aunt traveled with you to these smaller homes as well, or was she still at the
No,
main villa?
you're right. She remained in charge.
Okay.
But the family collection was banned to be recognized.
Okay.
And with me were two cousins who were her sons, and they couldn't call her mom, or couldn't recognize any connection. That was part of the whole subterfuge.
Okay. Yes.
And so anyway, that's how it was. We were kind of dispersed. Well, what happened later, quite soon after, is that the war caught up with us, because very soon after we were already up there in these hills, but the Soviet forces reached Budapest and completely surrounded the town. And the German forces weren't allowed by Hitler to leave while they could, because he just sacrificed the whole contingent in order to slow down the Soviets. The war was lost. Everybody knew that, but he didn't care about people ever. And because we were close to the royal castle, and although the royal castle, which was the residence of the regent, was a very elaborate palace, but built on top of the medieval castle, with very strong walls and underground parts and so on. So this became the place of the last stand of the German army, including some still loyal Hungarian troops. Absolutely hopeless situation. But they weren't allowed to leave. So now the front line. First the Russians conquered the Pest side of the Danube completely, and the hilly part on the other side was still in German hands. All the bridges were blown up in order to slow down the advance. But because the whole town was totally surrounded, that didn't stop the Russians to reach us. And suddenly we became the epicenter of the last climatic fight, house-to-house fighting. It was total destruction in the end. The royal castle was on fire and gutted, etc. Now, I ought to just jump back a bit in time, because as I was taken up into this place from home, they sent down a gardener, actually he was, a sympathetic person, not non-Jewish person, to bring the children up into these homes. That was in October, and this was a day when Admiral Horthy, the dictator, if you like, just made a declaration in the radio to say that Hungary has left the alliance and so on. It was quite a hopeless gesture, because it wasn't backed by forces or anything. And of course, the Germans surrounded the castle with their guns trained on the castle as a result. And it is then that I was taken past them. And there were checkpoints. And this man had some magic piece of paper. I think he must have visited Germany at one point and had a piece of paper signed by Hitler or something like that. And he showed that to the guards, when they immediately stood to attention and waved us through. That's how I went past. And it was then that Horthy, Admiral Horthy, the dictator, was arrested by the Germans. Arrested and taken into a camp somewhere, but not in terrible conditions. As a result, Hoti survived the war and unfortunately went into quite peaceful retirement on the shores of Portugal. When Salazar was still a fascist dictator there, so it was a good place to go. So shortly after that, when we were already up in these homes, the fighting actually reached us, the house-to-house fighting. And the next sort of direct memory I have is a German army at Christmas time, and the German army invited us to spend the Christmas with them, the Jewish boys that they thought were refugees and Gentiles. And this invitation couldn't be refused. And I have very clear memories of what it was like. We arrived at this hall, which was prepared with a long white table, beautiful white tablecloth and settings with little twigs of fir trees decorating it, and a Christmas tree at the end, and a huge Nazi flag with swastika hanging at the end of the room, and we were seated, one Jewish boy, one German soldier.
Oh wow! And I mean, so what was it like as a 7-year-old? And I'm sure all the other kids are also between like 5 and 10 or younger, and all of you are basically engaged in like subversive behavior. Like, was there not fear that one of the kids would just innocently?
Yeah, we were coached
give it away?
to that if asked what our name was,
Yes.
and so on, not to.
And the Germans suspected nothing. They were just
Nothing.
like, these are orphans from the Gentiles who died in the war.
On that particular occasion, they but it was varied. There were some German officers, a bit more Wehrmacht officers, not Nazi, who did realize. And apparently they talked to Stalo, the leader, to say, well, actually we know what's going on, and we now have to go because we are being replaced somewhere else, etc. But in parting, I must tell you that there is a rabid Nazi officer, so-and-so, we got to watch out for him.
Oh, wow.
So, it varied, and one particular memory I have as well, during the fighting, that a German heavy machine gun platoon came into the building where we were and said to our leader, my aunt and others, they said, your building has a flat roof and a good location for us, a certain height. We are going to set up upstairs on top the machine gun positions. And the leader said, just look round, see the number of kids. Is it not possible that you might find another flat roof nearby? And because if you, because we would be targeted by the Soviet artillery, which was far superior to German by then. And they said okay, and went. So there was humanity sometimes, particularly in a sort of traditional Wehrmacht part of the army. But amongst them, there were rabid Nazis dotted amongst them, in a minority in number. And there was one particular infamous officer in our area, Nazi officer, whose pastime was to hunt down people who were absconding from the front line and hiding out in various places, and he would search buildings, and when they find one, he would shoot them straight away. and that was a Nazi. So that there was a variety of people. We had to move a number of times because the building over our heads were just shot to pieces, and we had the German army help us move, for example, from A to B.
Wow. And so how do you eventually leave Budapest, Hungary? How do you eventually find your family? What eventually happened to your father?
Yeah. Well, we had to relocate during the fighting several times.
Within Budapest?
Within Buda, within our
Okay, just
area.
a small little place, yeah.
And that rhymes with the Gazan experience as well. Because each time it was dangerous because we're still hiding as well, and we didn't have whilst we started at a Swiss protected safe destination, the subsequent one weren't, and there is one memory of us temporarily being put up in a school, nearby school, converted into military hospital, again similar to Gaza, and we were there. We were given a room there, and there for a couple of days, and then my aunt overheard people, local nurses, talking amongst themselves, saying, "These aren't genuine refugees, I think these are Jewish kids." The following day, she decided we couldn't stay. We went on.
Wow. So, can you speak a bit to what your psychological state was, if you can remember, as a kid back then? Because you're moving around, you're uncertain where your parents are, you're uncertain where your sister. Obviously, was this in the back of your mind or was it in the front of your mind? Because at the front of your mind, maybe it's survival.
Neither.
What was in your mind? Like, what was going through your mind?
Well, that's an interesting part. That as a 7-year-old, I was never afraid because I did not fully measure up
the consequences,
the
what's
situation.
going on.
I was just told to go from here to there, and went, do this, stand there, and I only realized the immense danger retrospectively.
When you say retrospectively, and I know we're jumping ahead now, but this was after you were in safety as a teenager or as an adult?
Certainly as a teenager, as I was growing up and a bit more.
And by then you were in the UK?
No, it's still in Hungary.
Okay,
Yeah, and the other thing that I realized, which affected my sort of state of mind, perhaps more than I know, is a reflection of the fear and anxiety of the adults around me. Because as a kid, I wasn't afraid.
Yes.
But,
you were less
but I
afraid.
saw the adults being scared stiff in places. On one occasion, my father, who was still, when we were still in a Budapest flat, sometimes going out, although it was dangerous to go out as a Jew because you could be asked for the papers and so on. There were these raids. Because what I forgot to mention is that when Admiral Horthy was arrested, the alternate fascist groups, the Arrow Cross, came to power, Arrow Cross Party, and their militias started to rule Budapest, and it was a rule of terror. They hunted Jews, and if they found them, they killed them. And I'll come back to that because there's one particular story that is particularly awful. For example, actually, near where we were in Buda, there was a Jewish hospital, and this Arrow Cross raided the hospital. It was a Jewish hospital, so there's no doubt all there were Jews. And they ordered in pairs all the patients, doctors and nurses into the courtyard and shot them, all of them. It was a massacre. They were well-known massacre, and there were a couple of these things. And again, hospital, etc., rhymes with Gaza.
With Gaza, yeah. And executions and
and a complete dehumanization. I want to just tell you as an illustration of how unafraid, strangely, I was, that on one of our night escapes from one place to another, we had to go through a snow-covered back gardens led by some nice guys and held by some German soldiers. One particular one was carrying a Jewish boy in his neck, pretty much. And we were shot at from the Russian front line. And I clearly remember bullets whistling past. I could hear it. So that was mortal danger, but
you were just walking.
That must have been a bullet. Yeah,
Okay,
that was it. So very strange. I find it difficult to understand why that was so. But that's a fact.
How did you then sort of? And I know I'm moving forward again, but how did you then get reunited with your family? Have you seen all of them?
Well, we went from place to place. The whole series of different places. And as mentioned earlier, my mom was in charge of a girls' group somewhere else. The liberation was a memory, a very clear, it's like a picture of suddenly we were in this basement area a few steps down, a crowded basement, with all kind of people sheltering, and suddenly a Cossack soldier appeared in the doorway with his machine gun and a huge kind of fur hat. And a fierce-looking character looked round and said, "Nemetsky?" That's all he was interested in, whether there are any Germans there. He said, "No." Okay. And he went. That was the moment of liberation.
Wow. That's very interesting. And what happened once? I mean, when that happened?
Yeah. Well, then more came, etc.
For you as a 7-year-old,
frontline Russian troops were harmless, and they didn't mind the civilian population, notwithstanding they were enemy, as far as they were concerned. It was difficult to explain that. No, we are enemy, but we are Jews, and we were suffering.
Yes, of course. They just
because he didn't speak Russian. But the second and third wave, who were not the fighters, but follow up, they were pretty awful for women particularly.
So those were the occupying forces. Those who came to occupy. Yes.
But they were a mixed bunch. They weren't, if you can say that, apart from fairly common raping actions. Otherwise, they weren't cruel. I mean, they were distributing food. I remember getting my first loaf of bread from them, and post-war, and soup and so on. And they were very strange. They were very different from the Germans. The Germans always moved in disciplined formations. The Russians were like a wave of people, no clear form to them, but they were still effective. How did we meet up? When my mother's place was liberated as well, she started on a journey to find me actually, particularly. And
so she was with your sister.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And she went to the place, the address she knew, and said, "Oh yes, they were here, but they were bombed out." And I think they went on, try address so-and-so. And she went on a whole chain of places until she actually found me.
What was that moment like for you when you see your mother? I mean, did you understand the gravity of seeing your mother again, or was it just...
Well, I was overjoyed. She was also at Christmas, just on the same Christmas when the Germans invited us. And now another day of the same Christmas, my mom braved, by then almost warlike situation and all the dangers of being asked for papers and arrested, to come and visit me for Christmas and brought a present, a tiny, tiny aeroplane. And I remember the joy of that, and also the sadness of it, because he said, "You ought to know your dad just been taken to Belgium," and she was very sad. Now, all the papers she had to protect her on this journey was a photograph with a Red Cross headdress,
Yes.
and on the back a police statement and stamp that this is so-and-so, born such and such, religion Reformed Church. That was her only document.
So for a forged document, basically.
Yes. Well, actually, that I don't know how she talked that police station into, because it had that official stamp on it. I have this original today, which is a really precious thing.
Yes, of course.
Which if you're interested, I can send a copy.
Yeah, we may take a. It would be good if we get a picture of it. We can put it in the episode. Yeah.
So that was all. I was very brave of her, and then she went back. So when we were reunited, our main interest was to visit our home in Budapest, in Pest side. But all the bridges were blown up. So we had to wait until the Russians built a pontoon bridge, temporary pontoon bridge. Then we got hold of a little hand cart that you could pull, so that if we found things in the flat, not robbed still, and so on, we could put in and save it. So we went across, and when we got to our house, it looked like a doll's house. The outside wall completely down, because there was an ammunition dump in a school in front of it on a square, which had a hit, and it went up and took down all the walls of the buildings around. It was such an enormous explosion with the ammunition dump going up in one go. And so you could look into our flat like you look in a doll's house, with some furniture still there and so on. And because it was a modern concrete framed building, it's only the walls were pushed in, but the structure still stood, and the concrete staircase we could use, and we went up there, and my mum pulled out drawers, and there were still things there, kind of dishcloths and all kinds of things, which she collected up into a bundle and put it in a cart outside and said, "Well, let's go for a coffee." You know what's coming. Well, when we came back, that was stolen.
Oh, wow.
And this was, in all the history of this, the only time I saw my mum cry, then she couldn't get over that those little saved things were stolen.
It's so interesting, that psychology, that all of this is happening to you, but that last bit that you can't save and is taken from you.
Yes.
And maybe not taken from the enemy.
A final injustice.
The final injustice, yes. Also, it's not taken by then the enemy's gone, So
and luckily, obviously, actually, I want to mention this because that's another link with Gaza, that the first site of our building, our home, destroyed, was, I think, must be similar to Gazans coming up from the shelter and suddenly their home is gone above them.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about it as you said. There's half a concrete staircase.
At a glance, you take in a loss of lifetime's work, because that, particularly for the Gazans, who found it very difficult to build anything with all the restrictions and materials and so on. I imagine it might have taken a family a decade or two to bring together a house
Possibly longer. And I mean,
Yeah.
with Gaza, entire neighborhoods have also
Yeah,
been
yeah.
flattened. So some do go back to what's a remnant of a house, and others, there's just nothing to
And
go
this
back
is
to.
something that difficult to realize. We all know about the mass murders and so on, but to take in at a glance that your life effort is gone in an instant. What kind of experience is that?
Yeah, no, I do. When we often talk about death tolls and we talk about hospitals and how many
Yes,
have
yeah.
been bombed, and I've always felt that the biggest injustice is that 2 million people's lives and hopes and dreams
Yes,
have just been utterly destroyed.
Absolutely,
and
absolutely.
taken away.
and also the agony of decision making, life and death decisions, based on rumors or actually information from the enemy. And you have to make instantaneous decisions affecting the whole family's life. They sometimes in Gaza divided the family to have a greater child, or they.
Or they all. I mean, I was speaking to a journalist very close to. This was almost like 15 months ago, and she said that she's a journalist, but she would sleep with her family in the same bed, and the men were on the floor above, and they make sure they're sleeping in the same. So if they go, they all go together.
Yeah, I mean,
And this is how they
the
survive that
agony
situation.
of going
Yeah.
through that doesn't communicate very easily. Do you know about P21?
No.
It's a Palestinian based sort of cultural center, come restaurant, come coffee place.
Okay, in London.
In London,
Yeah.
yes, and they put on programs, sometimes with very interesting thing. And I went there when they had a series of letters from Gaza as it was going on. They had a connection, a journalist or writer, who was sending in his experiences as it was going on. And A, it was heartbreaking, and B, it was resonating with what happened with us and our family. This would give you one example that my family in Transylvania, who were farming, between the wars, Transylvania, which is a large landmass, was given over to Romanian rule as Hungary, Austria-Hungary lost the war, or the First World War, and so Hungary lost 2/3 of its traditional territories, including Transylvania, where my family farmed. But the Vienna Treaty or declaration by Hitler returned peripheral territories to Hungary as a kind of payoff for joining the invasion of the Soviet Union. And half of Transylvania, including where my family farmed, was returned to Hungary. At once, they were in greater danger because the Romanian king and ruling circles were less in cahoots with the Nazis than the Hungarian. And where my family farmed was a mixed area, and many of their workers were actually Romanian, not Hungarian. And some of the Romanian workers approached them after the return to Hungary and said, look, you don't realize you are in much greater danger than you think with the Hungarian authorities. We could take you over to the Romanian side illegally. We know a route, by horse and cart. We could, and I think you should do it. And my family turned it down because one elderly member, they judged, could not take such a bumpy ride to Romania. And the entire family was wiped out, was later taken to Auschwitz, and only two young, and one young cousin came back, survived, and that's another story, an interesting one. Because I think I ought to now jump over to that period that survivors of the Holocaust in Hungary, taking two examples, my aunt, who was instrumental in bringing us up.
This is the same aunt?
It's not the same who looked after us. It's another aunt who was in the same organizing group, working as a nurse as well, Red Cross nurse. They all did. But she was another convert into the Reformed Church. She was the only one who took it really seriously.
Okay, so she took her conversion seriously.
Yes, and she was kind of influential with the group, and she arranged us being taken up into that protected home thing. She returned to Transylvania after the war, but by then Transylvania was returned to Romania, predictably, because that was a gift of Hitler for Hungary. And the one cousin who returned from Auschwitz also returned to Transylvania. So they were later under the Romanian communist regime, ruled by Ceausescu, and before Ceausescu, George Desh. But Ceausescu struck a deal with Israel that he would allow Romanian Jews to go to Israel for a price. For each one had, I don't know, a couple of $1,000 price, or I'm not sure of the exact price, but significant amount for him. And under that scheme, both the aunt, who was so brave, actually, this was one of the aunts who went to the camp and took out
your father.
So a heroic person. And the other, and the cousin, who survived Auschwitz because she was put to work in sorting clothes, before going into the gas chambers. People, because it was supposed to have been shower units, left all their clothes behind by order. And then later the Germans used some of it, which was useful for the home country or the front, warm things, etc. She was one of the sorters in this warehouse, cousin Judith. And one day she was sorting her parents' clothes, which must have been absolutely traumatic. And yet she survived and came back. And she, as well as the heroic aunt, both ended up living in Haifa, in Israel. And when I visited them in the 60s for the first time, I realized that they became racists, both of them.
Like anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian racists?
Anti-Arab, as they called them, not Palestinians, racists, out and out racists, including the still practicing, to her death she was practicing seriously, Christian Reformed Church Christianity.
I want to get to that, but before that, just what happened to your father? And when did you learn about the story? What happened to him?
Well, as I mentioned, he was transferred to Theresienstadt. And this is something that he mentioned about the liberation. He said the liberation was a kind of quiet affair. One day, they realized that there weren't any German guards about. And the following day, the Russians walked in.
Okay.
And soon he was given a little pass, which I inherited, a tiny document in Russian and I don't know what other language, but mainly in Russian, that this person can travel across Europe. It's okay. It's an ID. But there was no transportation. So they had great difficulty, on top of goods trains for a while and then walk for a while and then another train. It took them ages to get back. And the whole of Europe was full of main roads with people walking this way and that way, trying to get home.
And what was it like when you were together as a family again?
Yeah.
What was your new family home
well,
like?
Because of being bombed out or having lost our home, as I explained, we were put up by my uncle, who was in central Budapest, had a very nice large flat. He was a well-off, in normal circumstances, well-off dentist with all kinds of society clientele and an art collector, a rich man. And he gave us a room. The building was like most Hungarian turn-of-the-century buildings, around a court, multiple stories with galleries running around for access. And it was a heart of the town. The building was opposite the Academy of Music, as it happens, on a square. And I was playing in one of these corridors outside. And suddenly I saw at the end of the corridor my father appearing. We haven't had any news of him. Or whether
Wow. So just out of nowhere.
Out of nowhere. There he was. He said, he was a psychoanalyst, and said it was a very interesting phenomena that as you saw me, you shouted, and you didn't run towards me, but run towards your mum. He said, Dad is here.
How long had it been since you last saw him?
Well, actually not so many months, because I think I must have last seen him in September. No, October, I think. October. From October to July, June,
Okay.
July.
So about 9 months.
Yeah. But we had no news whatsoever. And all we had was lists of survivors posted in shop windows. And you had to go and study and hoping you find your relative's name. It was so desperate that my mom on one occasion took me by the hand. I said, we're now going to a fortune teller to try and find out if your dad is alive.
How did you rebuild your life as a family? Where did you go? What did you do?
Well, for a while, as I say, we were at my uncle's place, He was very kind. And then my father found a half ruined kind of, well, perhaps not ruined, dilapidated flat in a central block that you could simply make an application for because it was abandoned. Lots of abandoned flats at that time, shortly after the war. And then the next year, 1945, we are talking about. And he made an application that he would repair it, and against that actually we had very little rent. It was council owned. And there was a large flat, actually, 5 rooms. And that's where, he repaired it, and he restarted his practice as a psychoanalyst. Some of his patients survived, and so he could get going again. He and all members of my families who survived or came back, all of them joined the Communist Party. My father...
Was that because of sort of like a gratefulness to the Russians, or what was the reason for
Well,
that?
there was something... The way I remember my father saying, I joined them because they were the only serious resistors of the fascists.
Okay, so gratefulness to the Russians, in one way or the other.
Well, actually, the illegal Communist Party was resisting too. You see.
Okay, yeah, I see.
No, there was a sense of gratefulness to the Red Army, yes, but also.
But inside Hungary during the war, resistance was from the Communist Party.
Yeah, but as much as it wasn't very significant, but
Okay.
it existed. Strangely enough, the two leaders of the illegal Communist Party, the two secretaries, one was Laszlo Rajk, the other one János Kádár. They were heroic people, in mortal danger in what they were doing. After the war, Laszlo Rajk became Minister of the Interior in a coalition government, because immediately after the war there was a period, 3 years, of coalition government. The Communist Party didn't take over immediately. There were democratic elections, but the Communist Party came third or something like that. The most popular party was equivalent of a mild conservative, something like Macmillan type conservative, not like today's conservatives. And it's called the Smallholders Party. And they, a part of them joined the resistance against the... And the second was the Social Democratic Party, and the Communist Party was third. So there was a period of coalition, but by 1948, by various means, the Communist Party took over.
Okay, so just moving ahead, so you eventually get to the UK and you build your life. Sort of, you mentioned the story about going to Haifa and meeting your two aunts who had become sort of racist. At what point in your life did you start thinking about Israel as a settler colonial state?
Then,
So when your visit
Yeah.
to Haifa.
yes.
And what did you think of Israel before that?
Hardly thought about them, to be honest. Because it's important to know that in Central Europe, including Hungary, under the Habsburg Empire days, the Hungarian Jewry, particularly the educated section, the professionals, are entirely, all of them, assimilationists. They weren't interested in Israel, and we were aware of small group of Zionists somewhere
Going to Israel, but yeah.
or preparing to go and sort of having their own thing, and they were regarded as freaks and extremists. And various times when Hungarian Jews had a choice to go to Israel or somewhere else, they usually went somewhere else. The US, Australia, a lot of them, Canada, and even Scandinavia, but not Israel as a first choice.
Okay.
So I was virtually unaware.
So how did that, going to Haifa and seeing your aunts and seeing how their views had changed, how did that impact you?
I was horrified, quite simply. I couldn't understand.
But were you horrified to the extent that I just have racist aunts? Or is it more like this entity that exists, Israel, is a problem? What was your thoughts at the time?
I thought it was a cruel, illegitimate state, yes. By virtue of their treatment of the indigenous population, And because they were militarized and extremely nationalist.
And this is, so it's in the 60s. Is it before 67 or is it?
It's before 67,
Okay.
yes. I remember one particular visit from Haifa to a kind of conducted visit to Jerusalem, when Jerusalem was still divided. And I was shocked by the way our guide was talking about the other side across the dividing barbed wire fence.
Did you at that point? So I mean, I want to delve into like sort of what your life was professionally and also your Palestinian activism. But at that point, did you, in the 60s, when you're going on this tour and there's people talking, did you already see the similarities between the Palestinians and what sort of occurred to the Jewish
absolutely.
people? So immediately
it was incomprehension that in the light of what we experienced, you could...
So immediately it was a similarity. Like you saw, it wasn't just you treating people really badly. It's you treating people the way we were treated 25 years ago.
The people who are doing it are the ones who themselves went through it, kind of thing.
And so immediately that was clear to you.
Yes, absolutely. Incomprehension about how, particularly us, could cross that line.
Did you challenge your aunts about that? Like, or were you just being polite? Because I mean, they are your aunts after all.
Typically, as a guest, I was polite. But I do remember one particular occasion which dramatized this for me. That we were with my aunt watching together a newsreel, and there was a Palestinian demonstration. And suddenly helicopter gunships appeared above them and shooting into the crowd. Unarmed crowd.
So this is
now,
a
I don't know whether
demonstration happening inside what is today Israel, or was
inside what is today Israel. And I don't know whether it was rubber bullets or it doesn't matter. I mean, it's completely brutal.
terrifying.
Terrifying. And I said comments in total horror and so on. And my aunt, who was a practicing, genuine Christian at that point, I inherited her Bible where everything is underlined and so on. And she said, "What's the problem? They're Arabs, aren't they?" It's completely incomprehensible to me. And yet she was this genuine believer in Christianity, which had to be kept quiet from the neighbors, because in Israel it's not popular to be Christian. I just couldn't understand it. And yet she was trying always, when I visited, to convert me to Christianity.
So at that point, like by the 60s and 70s, I mean, by then you what did you become? Did you become a doctor, a lawyer? Architect. So by then
I was completely absorbed
in your work.
Yeah.
And what were your parents? Are they still alive at this point? And what are their views on Israel Palestine at this point in the 60s, 70s?
I think my father never considered going, except just very briefly at one point in desperation after 56, the uprising, but that diminished very quickly, and because during the uprising there was a recurrence of anti-Semitism, quite nastily. I explained that he was a psychoanalyst, but during the communist period, psychoanalysis was banned. Freud was not acceptable, and he retrained. He retrained as a public health official, and initially was a district public health officer in a central district, and later an organizer of a network of institutes of epidemiology and etc. And hygiene, which had sub stations in various towns and a headquarter institute in Budapest, and he was made the director of it. So he was a pretty influential person within his profession and a high position. I mean, he was second in charge of public health of Budapest, and in that capacity he had the power to close places. For example, in times of danger of some epidemic, to close all swimming pools and stuff like that. So it was really quite a difficult job. During the revolution, in his place, a workers' council was formed. Workers' councils formed all over the place during the revolution, and it was one at his institute. But it had nothing to do with workers. The people who ran it were the previous regime's defunct politicians and followers. And they had a meeting where he wasn't present, and said, it is now time to nominate a Hungarian for a director. And that's a direct example of
Anti-Semitism.
Of the anti-Semitism rearing its head again.
So how did you guys get to the UK? And again, just sort of what was their conception, your parents' conception of the state of Israel? That, like, not just whether they considered going, but were they aware that this is a racist state? Or did you share your journey with them?
My father, despite the fact that he was a genuine communist, thought that he had a very dark view of Hungarian anti-Semitism, that it can erupt time and again, as it did during '56. And even before '56, he was kind of talking to me that I should not stay in Hungary. And that's coming from somebody who was a communist regime supporter. And he one time he kind of completely surprised me in saying that when the Rome Olympics will come, that was after, I think, after the Helsinki, there was a Helsinki Olympics, which was still during the communist period, and then at '56 it was in Australia, I think, or New Zealand, somewhere there, and then Rome would be the next. And he was saying, by the Rome Olympics, then the travel restrictions are eased for Olympics, so that you can go. Tourism. And I will arrange that you will go and don't come back. So that illustrates his
thinking.
His thinking, yes. But he wasn't a supporter of the '56 uprising. I was, because there was kind of reform communism arising, and socialism with a human face and so on. We were very hopeful that there would be a renewal. I just want to mention, I told you about the two communist leaders who were leading the illegal Communist Party. Laszlo Rajk, who became Minister of Interior after the war, and in '49 he was demoted to Foreign Secretary, because Minister of Interior in charge of the secret police was a top position. Foreign Affairs was less important because that was all done by Russia anyway. And so he was Foreign Secretary when he was arrested as a follower of Tito. And there was a short trial, and he was executed, as well as others with him. And he was completely innocent. The other leader of the illegal Communist Party was János Kádár, was also arrested. He became Minister of Interior, and he was arrested as a Minister of Interior and tortured and imprisoned. And he was freed during the Khrushchev thaw, when he condemned Stalin in his secret speech. Then all these satellite leaders of communist countries had to come clean about their crimes. And the amazing thing was that they somehow imagined that they could come clean, say sorry for killing innocent comrades, and stay in power. That was an impossible proposition.
So when do you move to London? And
Well, when the 56 uprising was finally put down, and János Kádár, the other illegal leader, who during the pause between the two attacks of the Russians, the free period of 10 days, he made a radio speech to say that we are going to restart the Communist Party, and it will be small but democratic, and we will have a long road ahead of us, etc. But it will be genuine and unlike the careerists of the previous party, and so on. And that was very hopeful. Suddenly he disappeared and joined the Russians, and they came back on a Russian tank with the Russian second invasion. So it was it was a betrayal, and it was a completely disillusioning experience, adding to the revolution, the fight, obviously not succeeding. And then there was a huge exodus of Hungarians. I mean, huge by our terms. By international terms today, they're not so big. I mean, 200,000 people left. And so I joined as well. I was second year student at university, studying architecture, and I was listening to the BBC broadcasts in Hungarian a lot. And there was one broadcast which said Hungarian students who feel they have to leave for political reasons and come to the UK will be able to continue their studies on grants. I said, I'm off.
So you came by yourself, or did your family come with you?
No, I came with a cousin.
Okay.
The cousin was a medical student near his.
And your parents stayed in Hungary?
Yeah, they stayed.
And so
The idea was that it was illegal crossing and unknown as to how difficult or not. The Russian troops were along the boundary, and as well as Hungarian troops, some for the revolution, some against. It was chaotic. It was very uncertain, the whole situation, and so we talked about the fact that I will go first, and if it's not too bad, I will give word, and then maybe they will follow. But they didn't follow.
Okay, so you've lived here with your family eventually passed away. Your parents, I'm guessing, passed away in Hungary.
Yes.
Okay. When did you sort of become a pro-Palestinian activist, in the sense that you felt very strongly about going for protests, having solidarity with what's going on? It went beyond just, your aunts become racist and the state is. And how much of that was solely influenced around your experience there and your memories of the Holocaust, or was it influenced by the protest against the Vietnam War, the Intifadas, the Gulf War, various Gulf Wars? What was the role
I
there?
didn't join the protest against the Vietnam War, the demonstrations. I kept saying the last demonstration I took part in ended with tanks on the street. And I'm now concentrating on architecture. But I was always left inclined and always Labour voter. I was attracted by people like Tony Benn and like. When and it was anti-Thatcher, of course. And when Tony Blair won the election and it looked like a kind of great new start, that's when I joined the Labour Party. And I became active in the Labour Party. At one point, our local MP was Frank Dobson, who I liked. And at one point on the Frank Dobson's being our MP, and when the local party chair of the constituency party chair was Raj Chadha. Do you know about Raj Chadha? He's a human rights lawyer, very much on the left today, who, amongst other things, successfully defended what's the name of the Palestinian woman who had a lot of trouble with the Labour Party, an MP.
I think you know we spoke, but name escapes me now. But I know what you're speaking about.
Anyway,
yes.
she was taken to court with false allegations like that, and Raj defended him. And when he went for the MP's position, following the retirement of Frank Dobson, I supported him. He was chair of the local Labour Party, the Constitutional Labour Party, and at one point I was joint vice chair campaigns under his leadership. So when he went, and I liked him very much. And
what year was this about?
That was in late 70s, early 80s.
Okay.
And it's more like early middle 80s actually. And anyway, I was committed to him, to support him. When I was approached out of the blue by Keir Starmer, he must have, Frank Dobson, before retirement, must have given a list of activists to Starmer. And I had this phone call out of the blue.
So Starmer called you?
Yeah.
And when was this? Because Starmer's like a different generation entirely.
Well, after the defeat of Ed Miliband, when it became vacant, 2015.
Yes. Okay. So a long time after your involvement in the Labour Party.
Yeah. I had various posts,
Yeah.
very active in the Labour Party, organised aspects of campaigns time and again. And I had this phone call to say, can you come and see me at Café Renoir, Kentish Town, for a coffee and a chat. So I said, well, that's very kind, but I think you ought to know. I know what it's about, and you ought to know that I'm already committed to Raj Chadha, so you must be busy with your campaign. So if you withdrew the invitation, I wouldn't hold it against you. I said, you're not going to convince me. I'm for Raj. And he said, no, I'm interested in second preference even. And you must come. So I had an hour with Keir Starmer talking to me.
And what did he want from you exactly? I mean,
I think, thinking back on it, what he wanted me, as he wanted from others, I wasn't the only one, is to spread it how nice a guy he is.
He wanted to make a good impression.
Yeah, he was talking about, how local he is, how working class he was, dad, etc., connections to NHS, and name dropping galore, Oh, Ed Miliband, a great friend of mine. Oh, so it went on. He knew everybody. Everybody was his friend.
What was your thoughts of like the Iraq War in 2003?
Well, I was demonstrating then,
And
along with.
And was that the first
we
time
were
when you
taking we were taking the constituency flag to that demo.
And when was that the start of you demonstrating against like sort of global wars, like not just internal UK stuff, or did it begin?
I suppose that was the first
That was the
I
first.
took part in a global one. Yes.
And I mean, obviously, since the genocide in Gaza has begun, your demonstrating has become much more visible, right?
Yeah. The changeover, if I may say, is that first I had a lot of trouble with the false anti-Semitism campaign in the Labour Party.
Okay, so that was like we're under Corbyn.
Yeah,
that was
still
during Corbyn's
Corbyn
time, yeah.
leader, but our local MP by then, Keir Starmer.
Okay.
And I had a kind of a set-to with him at one meeting. And around that time, when the internal in the Labour Party, internally, this completely false and ridiculous anti-Semitism campaign started up, the false accusations of anti-Semitism, I was very committed against that. And that eventually led to trouble with the Labour Party. The first really important thing that happened, I joined Momentum. I was very enthusiastic for Corbyn and joined Momentum. And on one night, when we had a Momentum meeting with a Labour Party General Council meeting the following day. Do you know about the internal setup of the Labour Party? The General Council meeting sounds like a small group, but it isn't. It's the biggest meeting of the constituency party, where each branch sends delegates, number of delegates, and it's quite a big meeting, a monthly occurrence, sometimes addressed by the sitting MP as well, if they have one. And so we had this Momentum meeting, and we're discussing this ridiculous anti-Semitism, against anti-Semitism campaign, and others worded a very good resolution to be passed, to be submitted to this meeting and get it passed, and that we are against it, it's ridiculous kind of thing. And they looked around and said, well, who should present this? And you are a Holocaust survivor, it's best come from you. And this was the first time I spoke in public, because
in your capacity as a Holocaust survivor.
Yes, I said that would add to the strength of it.
Okay.
And that was the first time I spoke seriously in public, but I did. What I didn't realize when I accepted that role is first I had to follow the leader of the council, who spoke against the motion. And then Keir Starmer was the next speaker. And he said, I just come from a shadow cabinet meeting, and after great discussion and efforts, etc., we achieved final unity that we must root out this anti-Semitism.
And then you came.
And then I came and said, there ain't any here.
So when Keir Starmer was calling you for coffee, this was all after this?
No, that was before.
Okay.
No, he wouldn't call me for coffee after this. And because Actually, I went door knocking a few times with
Yes,
him,
yes.
because not only was he at our constituency, he was in our branch within the constituency, narrowly, because he was near neighbor. I used to meet him at a local Sainsbury, introduced me to his family at various times and so on. And so, because I presented the motion, it was up to me to accept or reject any amendment. And our right was desperate to amend it and water it down. And there were about 4 or 5 such amendments proposed, and I rejected each one. And then it was put to vote, and we won. And that was the last time a left motion was won in our constituency. After the meeting, I went up to Keir Starmer and said, "I'm sorry, Keir. I had to be honest about my experience. That I never experienced any anti-Semitism, nor have I seen anybody else experience any anti-Semitism in our constituency." Okay. But he was furious. He said, "Yes, but you divided the party." He's saying that, dividing the party, and stormed away.
So I mean, I want to it's kind of wrapping this up, but also speaking about the current your protesting and the crackdown on the protests.
Yeah.
And even your arrest, right? Because we're kind of moving into that.
I wasn't arrested.
Well, no, sorry, you're questioning. Apologies for that. You're questioning of the
Big
police.
difference.
So it kind of seems all connected, because there was that smear that there's elements of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. It now extends to the protests are anti-Semitic and the protests are violent.
Exactly. Yes.
And it also makes it very what you're questioning, you being questioned by the police. Do you think that's literally because of your prominence in the protests, or do you think it's related to your entire history?
No, it's because of the
this
mechanism of what happened that day. I ought to just briefly mention that I joined a small group, which I didn't start, but I thought was extremely valuable, and it's grown since I joined, of the Holocaust survivors and their descendants against the genocide in Gaza. That's a title. And we wear these placards so that as the marches file through, they see us displaying that. And it has a number of obvious purposes to show that there isn't a homogeneous support from Jews, and particularly in relation to Gaza. And these are not hate marches, because we receive very warmly, and these are not no-go areas for Jews, etc. All these things are effectively demonstrated by what we do. So that's important. And through that, there was a lot of interest in that group, and that's how I've been asked for so many interviews. But also, when I when I was invited to speak on a Holocaust Memorial Day, now 3 years ago, by a socialist group, which was proscribed by then by the official Labour, SLN, I don't know if you know them. Tony Greenstein is a leading member. He particularly asked me to address their meeting on Holocaust Memorial Day about Holocaust experience. I said, yes, of course. And they trailed me as one of those on the first, and immediately got a letter from the Labour Party that be on notice that if you go ahead as advertised, then you would be subject to a disciplinary investigation, which translated means you'll be thrown out. Nobody survives such an investigation at that time in the Labour Party. So I immediately resigned in response to that. Okay. With a letter, a very strong letter, actually, that went viral. And that's when I had, following that, the first interview with your setup, when Peter Auburn and David Hurst came to see me and interviewed me. And that was the first, and then others followed, because it became quite well known.
What do you think when you go back to the conference where you were voting on the anti-Semitism motion, and also you see there's this massive crackdown on free speech because of Gaza, and it's really ridiculous. I mean, the common notion that the media carries forward that these are hate marches against Jews and it's unsafe.
Well, it's a slander.
I mean,
it's a very opposite.
Besides just there being a very strong Zionist lobby, what do you think drives this ridiculousness?
What drives it, I think, generally, is that the right, the forces of the right, extreme right, discovered that the anti-Semitism charge is the most effective weapon against the left.
Okay.
Because people are so afraid and so gingerly about opposing it in case they are stamped as anti-Semites. So the intimidation that goes with it works beautifully. That's why they're using it internationally, not just here. But actually, in my resignation letter, I did say, I ended it with saying that in future, history will judge these days, and it will be said that it was the Labour Party who imported into British politics McCarthyism. And this will have short-term political advantages, but in the long term it will be condemned and a shame for the Labour Party.
Moving on to, the main thing that we're actually discussing today, Gaza. When you first started marching, did you think that there'd still be a need to be marching 19 months later now?
Probably not, because what was going on, the systematic destruction of a total environment and people in the 21st century seemed improbable, that it could be sustained, that the world wouldn't turn on it. But the world turned the other way. Now it's almost normalized. You have a small, well, not small, but an accident somewhere in the Alps of some ski slopes have some accidents, and a carriage falls down or something, and it's big news. 3 or 4 people died. In the meantime, on the same day, maybe several hundred Gazans are killed, and it's no longer a leading news. I think that normalization is awful.
Has the behavior of the Labour Party and Keir Starmer sort of surprised you at all? Specifically with regards Gaza?
It didn't. No, it doesn't entirely surprise me. After his statements and behavior in relation to the Labour Party. First of all, it's a political organization where political discussion was banned. I stopped going to meetings at that point because I wasn't going to be compliant with practices like that. And then the complete lie of how he became a leader of the Labour Party. The fact that he presented himself as essentially a continuation Corbyn, and then immediately turned on Corbyn's popular beliefs and on himself, completely falsely. After that, and also I think another critical moment was when the Board of Deputies produced a 10-point request or requirement of how the Labour Party should behave about how anybody criticizing Israel should be expelled, and anybody who supports somebody who says that also there are extreme penalties for association, even, let alone what you may say. A dreadful document, probably half of it illegal. And Keir Starmer, as a human rights lawyer, signed it. Well, after that, there was no surprise or anything he might do.
How is it you think that, why would Keir Starmer, given his record as human rights lawyer, go that far? But also, questions kind of connected to how did Israel manage to sort of be given this license? Like, has that surprised you that Israel has been given a license for 19 months by the world powers to do what it has done?
Well, it's unexplainable, yes. But the way it worked, I think, is that Israel claims impunity on account of the Holocaust sufferings, that somehow that justifies anything they might do because it was so enormous. And sort of it kind of gives them complete license. And then they use this license against the Palestinians. It's sort of an indirect transference. So the end result is that the Palestinian people, who had nothing to do with the European fascists' visitation on European Jewry, they are paying the price for it. Absolutely absurd.
When you think back to your younger days, sort of surviving the Holocaust and running around Budapest with your mom and your dad later on, and then coming to London after the Warsaw Uprising and starting everything else, did you think
the Budapest Uprising.
Sorry?
The
Budapest Uprising, sorry about that. Did you then think that at 87 you'd be protesting what you protested?
Well, I don't think I thought ahead like that. I was, frankly, I remained interested but disillusioned about politics because of the repeated frustration of dreams that, after the war, the communist-led renewal went into atrocities and total lack of democracy. The betrayal of that lot, the clique that was ruling then. And unfortunately, the inner clique of that communist Stalinist group were all Jews on top of that. And then the disappointment of the betrayal of the 56 uprising. So after all that, I really withdrew from politics, active politics, and I was always interested in art, passionately interested in art, and I have been doing drawings and practicing art when I could right through my life. And I was concentrating on that.
If you could speak back to the boy who survived the Holocaust, what words would you have for him?
You should have been more afraid. I don't know really. After the war, I was a very enthusiastic young pioneer, which was kind of. We had a Boy Scouts movement in Hungary, which unfortunately the Hungarian right-wing nationalists exploited, so militarized and so on. But they weren't exactly banned, so there was a Boy Scout movement still after the war, but restarting the left wing on Russian Soviet model, the Young Pioneers movement, and I enthusiastically joined there. And it was full of kind of revolutionary excitement and hope, even at that young age. I mean, this is primary school. But all that has been kind of undermined and disappointed later. But I don't regret the experience. So it's difficult to advise my old self in a way, because I don't know what alternatives there might have been. I think I had followed the reasonable alternative in front of me. And in a way, what happened was almost inevitable in the circumstances.
What's your final thoughts, or anything that you want to sort of answer that I haven't asked you?
I think, well, that there is always the question, where does the Gazan and Palestinian story lead to? Because even on the left, and those who support Gaza and the Palestinians talk about the two-state solution, and I am for the one-state solution myself. I think maybe you need a two-state solution as a stepping stone towards a one-state, a completely democratic, equal rights, one-state solution. And I think that will come in the end, whether the road to it will be very bloody or just a long time and gradual development politically. It's impossible to say at this point. But the destination is a one-state solution. I'm convinced of that. And those Israeli Jews who are totally identified with the Zionist aims and goals will simply have to leave. And those who can accept democracy, genuine democracy, will stay. And same as in South Africa.
Stephen Kapos, thank you so much for your time.
Okay.